History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 8 The Latest Age. Chapter 5 Openings and Closings. The Indian Subcontinent. India, like China, did not at once share the violent financial and economic cycles of many East Asian countries. In this respect, undeniably, past policies favored her. Congress governments, though moving away somewhat from the socialism of the early years of independence, had long been strongly influenced by protectionist, managed, nationally self sufficient, even Tarasic ideas. The price had been low rates of growth and social conservatism, but with them came also a lower degree of vulnerability to international capital flows than other countries. In 1996, the Hindu and nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party (BJP) inflicted a major defeat on Congress and became the largest single party in the lower house of parliament. It was not able to sustain its own government, though a coalition government emerged that did not survive another very violent general election in 1998. This too was inconclusive in that no clear parliamentary majority emerged, but the BJP and its allies formed the biggest single group in it. Another coalition government was the outcome, whose Janata supporters soon published an ominously nationalist agenda that announced that India should be built by Indians. Some found this alarming in a country where nationalism, though encouraged by Congress for a century or so, had usually been offset by prudent recognition of the real vociferousness and latent violence of the subcontinent. Eventually, though the new government surprised many by avoiding Hindu nationalist excesses domestically and by stepping up the liberalization of economy, leading to increased economic growth in some parts of the country. This growth continued under the new Congress led government that, in another example of India's functioning democracy, surprisingly was voted into the office in 2004. The new Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh, an economist of Sikh origin, stepped up the attempts at opening India's economy and making it more competitive internationally. By the mid 2000s, India seemed to be at the beginning of a rapid economic expansion. Though it seemed consistent with the determination to win domestic kudos by playing the nationalist card, it was nonetheless in the context of the running sore of the old quarrel with Pakistan that the world had to strive to understand the Janata government's decision to proceed with a series of nuclear test explosions in May and June 1998. They provoked the Pakistan government to follow suit with similar tests of its own. Both governments were now members of the Club of Nations acknowledged to have deployable nuclear weapons. Yet larger contexts in which, to set this fact, the Indian Prime Minister pointed out, were those of Indian fear of China, already a nuclear power and remembered by Indians as the victor of the Himalayan fighting of 1962, and a growing sympathy shown by the Pakistan government to Islamic fundamentalist agitation in other countries, notably Afghanistan, where 1996 had seen the establishment of an intensely reactionary government in Kabul under the Pakistani supported faction named Taliban. Some gloomily pondered the notion that a Pakistan bomb might also be an Islamic bomb. In any case, there had been a huge setback to the curbing of nuclear proliferation so far achieved. There was universal alarm. Ambassadors were withdrawn from Delhi, and some countries followed the lead of the United States in cutting off or holding up aid to India. Some action, though, did nothing to deter Pakistan from following India's example. The world evidently did not rid itself of the danger of nuclear warfare by ending the Cold War. That danger, too, had now to be understood in a world that some thought much less stable than the 1960s had been, and with India-Pakistan relations still bedeviled by the Kashmir issue. A new Russia. Russia, the biggest and most important of the CIS states, elected Boris Yeltsin President of the Republic in June 1991 with 57% of the votes cast in the country's first free election since 1917. In November, the Russian Communist Party was dissolved by presidential decree. In January 1992, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a program of radical economic reform was launched, which, in one bold stroke, led to an almost complete liberation of the economy from previous controls. The economic result of this was, for almost all Russians, an unmitigated disaster. While a few insiders got very rich, most people lost their savings, their pensions, or their jobs. Energy consumption fell by a third, accompanied by rapidly rising unemployment, falls in national income and real wages, a drop in the industrial output by half, huge corruption in government organs, and widely ramifying crime. To many Russians, these abstractions were brought home in the savage detail of personal misery. Public health and life expectancy declined to less than 60 years of males in early 2000s, a drop of 5 years in less than a decade. In 1993, a new parliament containing many of his enemies had been elected to add to Yeltsin's difficulties. Others were posed by relations with non-Russian republics of the CIS, in which there lived 27 million Russians, and by the clans of political interest which had emerged around bureaucratic and industrial foci in the new Russia, as well as by disappointed ex-reformers of whom he had sacked a great many. It was not long before it began to be recognized that Russia's troubles were not solely attributable to the Soviet legacy, but owed much to the general state of Russia's historic culture and civilization. In 1992, Russia had itself become a federation, and in the following year, a presidential and even autocratic constitution completed the country's constitutional framework. But Boris Yeltsin soon had to face the challenge of opposition from both left and right, and eventually of insurrection. After he had suspended Parliament's function by decree on gradual constitutional reform, over 100 people were killed in the worst bloodshed in Moscow since 1917. Like his earlier dissolution of the Communist Party, this was seen as presidential high-handedness. No doubt, the president's personality made forceful action more congenial to him than patient diplomacy. Nevertheless, considering he had so little to offer Russians in the way of material comfort, as the economy was exploited by corrupt officialdom and entrepreneurs on the make, it was to the credit of his government and to the Russians' love of their newfound political freedom that he managed to fight off the neo-communist challenge and achieve re-election as president in 1996. 2 years before that, a new problem had emerged: a national insurrection in landlocked Chechnya, an autonomous republic in the Russian Federation with a predominantly Muslim population. Some Chechens deplored and would avenge, they said, the immorality of their conquest and suppression by Catherine the Great in the 18th century, and the genocidal policy carried out by Stalin in the 1940s. Their anger and resistance was strengthened by the brutality with which the Russians, alarmed by the dangerous example that might be set to other Muslims, reduced the Chechen capital to ruins and the countryside to starvation. Thousands were killed, but Russian casualties re-awoke memories of Afghanistan, and there were all too evident dangers of fighting spilling over into neighboring republics. Ever since 1992, after all, A Russian garrison had been propping up the government of now independent Tajikistan against the danger of its overthrow by Islamic radicals supported from Pakistan. Against this doubtful background, not much was left by 1996 of the hopes raised by perestroika and glasnost, and additional gloom was cast over the situation as it became clear that President Yeltsin's health was poor. By then, events outside Russia, notably in former Yugoslavia, prompted gestures and very vocal reminders to Western powers that the country still aspired to play the great power role it felt was its due. As well as of growing concern, Russia felt over the implications of intervention there in the affairs of an independent sovereign state. In 1998, however, the Russian government could hardly gather taxes and pay its employees. The year 1997 had been the first year since 1991 in which GDP had registered a real, if tiny, increase. But apparently, the economy was still abandoned to the mercy of special interests as the state sold off more and more of its investments to private business, often on a corrupt and favored basis. Huge fortunes were rapidly made by some, but millions of Russians suffered unpaid wages, the disappearance of daily necessities from the markets, continuing prices rising, and the irritations and hostilities that inevitably arose as high levels of consumption for some confronted poverty face to face in the streets. Then in 1998 came a financial crash and a repudiation of foreign debt. Yeltsin had to replace a prime minister he had chosen for his commitment to market economics and to accept one imposed upon him by his opponents. Yet the next parliamentary elections returned a parliament less likely to quarrel with him, and on New Year's Eve 1999, he felt able to announce his resignation. His successor was already at that moment serving as his prime minister. Boris Yeltsin duly announced that the next president should be Vladimir Putin, and accordingly he took up office after the election of March 2000. A former member of the KGB, Putin by then had to his credit in the eyes of many Russians a temporary, it turned out, success in pacifying Chechnya and the decline of the danger that its turbulence might spread beyond its original borders. It seems likely that outcry abroad over threats to human rights in Chechnya further helped to rally patriotic support behind Vladimir Putin. But he had also made a favorable impression in Western capitals, in spite of the misfortunes of a series of accidental disasters in his first months as president, which indicated the rundown state of Russia's infrastructure. There was a new sense that grave problems were, at last, going to be surmounted. In a more narrowly personal sense, that was no doubt true for Yeltsin, who, with his family, was assured by his successor of immunity from prosecution for offenses committed during his presidency. Putin's presidency put a new vigor into Russian government after the lethargy of the last Yeltsin years. The new president, only 48, when he took office, projected an austere and reserved image that most Russians liked after their extroverted but often inefficient predecessor. Putin wanted to be known as man of action. He immediately began re-centralizing power in Russia and cracked down on the super-rich, the so-called oligarchs, when they would not do the bidding of the Kremlin. After his re-election in 2004, concerns were voiced about the pressure his government exercised on Russian media critical of the president's policies. While the events of 11 September 2001 had given Putin a welcome chance to portray his aggressive conduct of the war in Chechnya as a war against terrorists, and thereby avoid too vocal a Western reaction, He had little success in bringing the conflict to a close. His attempts at influencing Russia's former Soviet neighbor states to take a more friendly attitude to the new Russia have also mostly backfired. Putin's most important contribution is to have created some form of economic stability. By 2005, inflation had been stemmed and Russian GDP was gradually increasing. Still, Vladimir Putin is likely to be seen as a transitional figure on the way to a new Russian society that retakes its place among the world's greatest centers of power. Pax Americana in the 1990s. Taking a long backward look from the early 21st century, the United States, much more clearly than in 1945, was the world's greatest power. For all the heavy weather of the 1970s and 1980s, and a cavalier piling up of public debt through budgetary deficit, its gigantic economy continued to show over the long run a huge dynamism and seemingly endless power to recover from setbacks. Its slowing as the 1990s drew to a close did not check this. For all the political conservatism which so often struck foreigners, the United States remained one of the most adaptive and rapidly changing societies in the world. Yet, at the last decade of the 20th century began, many old problems still remained. Prosperity had made it easier for those Americans who did not have to face those problems in person to tolerate them, but it had also actually provided fuel for the aspirations, fears, and resentments of Black Americans. This reflected the social and economic progress they had made since the Johnson presidency, the last that had seen a determined effort to legislate Black America out of its troubles. Although the first black state governor in the nation's history took up office in the 1990s, only a couple of years later, the inhabitants of Watts, notorious for their riots a quarter century before, again showed that they saw the Los Angeles police force as little more than members of an occupying army. Over the country as a whole, a young black male was 7 times more likely than his white contemporary to be murdered, probably by a fellow black, and was more likely to go to prison than to a university. If nearly a quarter of American babies were then being born to unmarried mothers, then 2/3 of the black babies were. An index of the breakdown of family life in the black American communities. Crime, major deteriorations in health in some areas, and virtually unpoliceable inner city areas still left irresponsible Americans believing that the nation's problems were racing away from solution. In fact, some of the statistics were beginning to look better. If Bill Clinton disappointed many of his supporters by the legislation he actually could deliver, the Republicans in Congress got much of the blame for that. Although, too, the burgeoning phenomena of rapidly growing numbers of Hispanic Americans swollen by legal and illegal influx from Mexico and the Caribbean countries worried many people. President Clinton set aside recommendations to restrict immigration further. The population of those with Hispanic ancestry had doubled in 30 years and now stands at roughly 1/8 of the total. In California, the richest state, it provided a quarter of the population and a low wage labor pool. Even in Texas, Hispanics were beginning to use politics to make sure their interests were not overlooked. Meanwhile, in a modish figure of speech, Clinton could surf the economic wave. Disappointments in his domestic policy tended to be attributed by supporters to his opponents rather than to his own failures of leadership and excessive care for electoral considerations. Although the Democrats lost control of the legislature in 1994, his re election in 1996 was triumphant, and success for his party in the midterm elections followed. Nevertheless, Clinton's second presidency was a disappointment. In his defense, it can be said that he had at the outset inherited an office sadly diminished in prestige and power since the Johnson days and the early Nixon years. The authority the presidency had accumulated under Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, and during the early Cold War years had swiftly and dramatically ebbed away after Nixon. But Clinton did nothing to stem the rot. Indeed, for many Americans, he made it worse. His personal indiscretion laid him open to much publicized and prolonged investigation of financial and sexual allegations, which led in 1999 to an unprecedented event, the hearing of charges by the Senate against an elected president with the aim of bringing about his impeachment. Yet Clinton's public opinion poll ratings stood higher as the hearings began than they had done a year earlier, and the impeachment attempt failed. Those who had voted for him were content, it seemed, with what he was believed to have tried to do, even if they were not oblivious to his defects of character. As the Clinton presidencies unrolled, the United States and the establishment had also come to appear to squander the possibilities of world leadership which had come with the end of the Cold War. Whatever the average reporting of American newspapers and television bulletins, there had seemed then to be a moment, some hope that traditional parochialism might be permanently in eclipse and that the United States would work with other countries globally to improve conditions for all. Concerns which require continuous and strenuous efforts by the United States in every part of the globe could hardly be ignored. They were indeed to loom larger still in the next 10 years, but this was soon obscured by the ambiguities of American policy. Clinton's aim was first and foremost to assist in the globalization of market economies and for other countries to learn from the success of the United States. While a multilateralist at heart, Clinton was much too careful a politician to risk going against an American public tired of international campaigns of the Cold War. Many issues that the United States could have taken a lead on, such as world poverty and global ecology issues, were therefore brushed under the carpet in return for his electorate viewing Clinton as the feel good president. He made them feel good in return for doing very little except enriching themselves. Soon, however, the peacekeeping activities of the United Nations were troubling American policy. While the 50th anniversary of the foundation of the UN in 1995 prompted Clinton to tell his countrymen that to turn their backs on the organization would be to ignore the lessons of history. His remarks were provoked by the action earlier that year of the lower house of the American Congress in proposing to cut the American contribution to the costs of UN peacemaking against a background, moreover, of American default on its subscriptions to the normal budget of the UN, amounting to over $270 million. United States policy seemed to reach a turning point with the collapse of the UN intervention in Somalia in 1993, which had led to casualties among UN forces taking part and to spectacular television footage of the maltreatment of the bodies of American servicemen by enraged and exultant Somalis. Soon, the refusal of the American participation or support of the UN intervention in the African states of Burundi and Rwanda showed what disastrous consequences could flow from American refusal to participate or to permit forceful intervention with ground forces in peacekeeping, let alone peacemaking. In these two small countries, each ethnically bitterly divided for generations into a ruling minority and a subject majority. The outcome in 1995 to 1996 was genocidal massacre. Over 600,000 were killed and millions were driven into exile as refugees. It seemed the UN could do nothing if Washington would not move. After President Clinton had authorized limited airstrikes against Bosnian Serbs forces to bring about the peace settlement that was finally signed at Dayton in 1995. There was much debate among scholars, journalists, and politicians about what the world role of the United States should be. Much of this debate centered around the proper use of American power and the ends to which it should be applied, and even about potential wars of civilizations. Meanwhile, Clinton's diplomacy appeared caught between the wish to create a world more amenable to US ideological goals and a wish to avoid military casualties, first and foremost amongst Americans. Among new international problems to be faced was the appearance of a new potential source of nuclear danger. North Korea's modest nuclear program in 1993 to 1994 showed that the United States was now one of the several of a slowly growing group of nuclear armed states, whatever its huge superiority in delivery systems and potential weight of attack. America had no reason any longer to believe that all of these states would make rational by American standards calculations about where their interests lay. But this was only one new consideration in policy making after the end of the Cold War. In the Middle East, early in the 1990s, American financial pressure over the spread of Jewish settlements on the West Bank looked for a time as if it might persuade the Israeli government, harassed by the Intifada and its accompanying terrorism, that a merely military solution to the Palestine problem was not going to work. Then, after great efforts, helped by the benevolent offices of the Norwegian government, secret talks between Israeli and Palestinian representatives at Oslo in 1993 at last led to an encouraging new departure. The two sides then declared that it was time to put an end to decades of confrontation and conflict, recognize mutual legitimate and political rights, and strive to live in a peaceful coexistence. It was agreed that an autonomous Palestinian authority should be set up to administer the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and that a definitive peace settlement should be concluded within 5 years. This appeared to promise greater stability for the Middle East as a whole. It gave the Palestinians their first significant diplomatic gains. But the continuing implanting of the new Israeli settlements in the area occupied by Israeli forces soon poisoned the atmosphere again. Optimism began to wilt when there was no cessation of terrorist attacks or of reprisals for them. Palestinian bombs in the streets of Israeli cities indiscriminately killed and maimed scores of shoppers and passerbyers, while a Jewish gunman who killed 30 Palestinians in their mosque at Hebron won posthumous applause for many of his countrymen for doing so. Even so, hope lingered on. Syria, Jordan, and the Lebanon all resumed peace negotiations with Israel, and a beginning was in fact made in the withdrawal of Israeli forces from the designated autonomous Palestinian areas. Then, in November 1995, came the assassination of the Israeli Prime Minister by a fanatical fellow countryman. The following year, a conservative Prime Minister, dependent on parliamentary support of Jewish extremist parties, took office. His popular majority was tiny, but it was clear that, for the immediate future at least, it was unlikely that any but an aggressive policy was further to be used for territorial settlement by Israel, and that would be forthcoming, and that the Oslo agreements were in question. Even the election of the new Labour government in 1999 did not lead to a return to the promise of the Oslo Agreement. The new negotiations led by Bill Clinton in the waning days of his presidency failed spectacularly in achieving any concrete settlement. Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat spent the remaining years of his life besieged by Israeli troops in his compound in Ramallah after a new Palestinian uprising broke in 2000. In 2006, the Islamist group Hamas, a party dedicated to extermination of Israel, won control of the Palestinian parliament. Americans were evidently doing no better than other outsiders to the region in grappling with the consequences of the creation of the Zionist program a century earlier and the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Nor did the United States' policy in the Persian Gulf provide lasting solutions there. Sanctions authorized by the United Nations did no good in Iran or Iraq, and patient and assiduous effort by the latter had, by the mid 1990s, to all intents and purposes, broken any chance of maintaining the broad based coalition of 1991 against it. Saddam's government seemed untroubled by the sanctions. They bore heavily on his subjects but could be tempered by the smuggling of commodities the regime desired. Iraq was still a large oil exporter, and revenues from this source made possible some restoration of its military potential, while no effective inspection of the country's production of weapons of mass destruction, as ordered by the United Nations, was taken place. American policy was, as far as ever, from achieving its own revolutionary and evident goal of overthrowing the regime, even when it fell back again for 4 nights in December 1998 on open aerial warfare to no avail. Nor did it help American prestige when suspicion arose that the timing of the bombing offensive might have some connection with a wish to distract attention from the impeachment proceedings about to begin in Washington. 1998 had begun with President Clinton stressing in his State of the Union message that domestic conditions indicated that these were good times for Americans. But this was not proven true in foreign affairs. In August, American embassies were attacked by Muslim terrorists in both Kenya and Tanzania, with heavy loss of life. Within a couple of weeks, there was an American reply in the form of missile attacks on alleged terrorist bases in Afghanistan and the Sudan. The embassy bombing were both linked by Bill Clinton to the mysterious figure of Osama bin Laden, a Saudi extremist, in a speech which also alleged that there was compelling evidence that further attacks against the United States citizens were planned. When in November, a Manhattan federal grand jury indicated Osama bin Laden and an associate over 200 charges relating to the embassy attacks, as well as to other attacks on American service personnel and an abortive bombing in 1993 of the World Trade Center in New York. It caused no surprise when he failed to appear in court to answer them. It was believed bin Laden was hiding in Afghanistan under the protection of Taliban regime, which had taken control of that country in the ruins of Soviet war in the mid 1990s. As 1999 began, Kosovo was at the center of the troubles of former Yugoslavia. When spring passed into summer, a strategic commitment at last undertaken in March to a purely air campaign by NATO forces against Serbia appeared to be achieving little except a stiffening of its people's will to resist and an increase in the flow of refugees from Kosovo. The Russians were alarmed by NATO action, unsupported as it was by UN authorization, and felt it ignored their traditional interest in the area. The casualties inflicted on civilians, both Serbian and Kosovan, were soon causing misgivings in domestic opinion within the 19th NATO nations. While the Serbian president, Slobodan Milosevic, had apparently had his confidence increased by Bill Clinton's assurance that there would be no NATO land invasion. What was going forward was indeed unusual. the armed coercion of a sovereign European state because of its behavior to its own citizens. Meanwhile, over three-quarters of a million Kosovan refugees crossed the frontier in search for safety in Macedonia and Albania, bringing stories of atrocities and intimidation by the Serbs. It appeared that it was the deliberate intention of Belgrade government to drive out at least parts of the non-Serb majority. Then came a disastrous mishap, acting on out of date information and therefore in avoidable error. American aircraft scored direct hits on the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, killing members of its staffs. Beijing refused even to listen to the apology Clinton attempted to give. An orchestrated television campaign had already presented the Chinese people with an interpretation of the whole NATO intervention as a simple act of American aggression. Well organized student mobs now attacked the American and British embassies in Beijing. Conveniently, students' team was thus let off in anti foreign riots. The deep Chinese concern about America's world role can hardly be doubted, nor can China's involvement, like Russia's, in the Kosovo crisis was likely to make it harder for NATO to achieve its aims. The Chinese were strong believers in the veto system of the Security Council, seeing it as protection for the sovereignty of individual nations. They were also disinclined to view with sympathy would be Kosovan separatists, sensitive as they had always been to any danger of fragmentation in their own huge country. In the deep background, too, must have lain thoughts of reassertion of their own historic world role, as well as the specific irritations of recent years. For a century after the Opium Wars, after all, China had never been without the humiliation of European and United States troops assuring order in several of her cities. Perhaps it had crossed the minds of some Chinese that it would be a sweet reversal of fortunes if Chinese soldiers should, in the end, form part of a peacekeeping force in Europe. Thanks to American presidents' wish to avoid at all costs the exposure of ground troops to danger, just as Bosnia had destroyed the credibility of the United Nations as a device for assuring international order. It now appeared that Kosovo might destroy that of NATO. Early in June, however, it appeared that the damage done by bombing, together with the timely Russian efforts to mediate and British pressure for a land invasion by NATO forces, were at last weakening the will of the Serbian government. That month, after meditation in which the Russian government took part, it was agreed that a NATO land force should enter Kosovo in peacemaking role. Serbian forces then withdrew from Kosovo and then the province was occupied by NATO. It was not the end of the troubles of the former Yugoslav Federation. In 2006, NATO soldiers were still there and there was still uncertainty about the long term future of Kosovo, even if the Serb minority was getting smaller as the Albanian majority used strong arm methods to control the province. But by then, there had been a notable change in the mood of the government in Belgrade, and the former Serbian president had been arrested and handed over to a new international court at The Hague, which had begun to try offenders against international law on war crimes and other charges. As Clinton presidency moved towards its close, he at different times asserted the need to reverse the decline in defense spending, indicated that the proposals for imposing limits on the emission of industrial gases damaging to the climate were unacceptable, and strove to reassure China by efforts to secure normal trading relations with her. China was to secure admission to the World Trade Organization in 2001. The Republican candidate in the presidential election of 2000, George W. Bush, emphasized in his successful campaign his anxiety to avoid the use of American troops on peacekeeping duties abroad, and that he would authorize the building of a nuclear missile defense system to protect the United States against rogue powers armed with such missiles. Earlier editions of this book have ended with the observation that we shall always find what happens somewhat surprising, because things tend to change on the one hand more slowly and on the other hand more rapidly than we tend to think. That seemed to be as true as ever when events of 11 September 2001 changed things anew.